Okay, we'll now call the Urbana Civilian Police Board to order, review board to order, time 5:35. Okay. Okay, roll call.
Ricardo Diaz.
Here.
Scott Dossett.
Here.
Ivy Williams.
Here.
Michael Lebinsky.
Here.
Grace Mitchell.
Here.
Megan McGinty. Diane Gattal.
Here.
Basilia Clark.
Okay, do you have a quorum? Are there any changes to the agenda? Any changes need to be made? Okay. Okay, we have the minutes for approval, needing approval for the July 26th meeting. Do we have a motion for approval?
So moved.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor, aye. Minutes have been approved. Okay, any staff reports? None?
None.
Okay. Any public participation? Okay. Any old business? Okay. New business, we do have a presentation that's going to take place, a training. Could Preston come up and introduce our presenter?
Good evening. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I heard like 3 people.
Good evening.
All right, there we go. So today for our CPRB meeting, we are having a implicit bias training. We've had one before, so this is kind of like a new refresher. It's a fresh look at our view of implicit bias presented by Morris Mosley. At this time, I'd like to introduce Morris.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm not sure which way is best to talk to everybody, so I'm going to move around a lot. My name is Morris Mosley, and I am a therapist here at the University of Illinois. I work with the Employee Assistance Program. And I mention that because it affects what I talk about in the context. So, in my job as a therapist, I have an obligation to keep track of myself. I have to be able to understand how my bias impacts what I do. And so my approach to bias is a little different in the sense that I see it as an asset. I see it as something that kind of keeps me sharp, helps me understand what things influence my opinion. Now, in relation to clients, I have a significant amount of influence, in which case I do have to be aware of what the basis of my decision-making is. Now, the issues with bias are kind of interesting because of the level of its existence. Bias, in and of itself, exists at a very low level of awareness, a subconscious level of awareness. So how do we determine its impact? For that matter, how do we get past the discussions about its existence? Is it real? Is it possible to not be biased? And then this negative connotation that happens with bias. Is it a bad thing? When you say the word, what comes to mind? Good or bad? Because everything that follows that matters. My response, my reaction to bias could be defensive from the beginning. And the reality is, it's in play whether I want it to be or not. So when I speak about bias, it's in the context of work. I could talk about bias in general and we could have great discussions, but what this is about application. In the workplace, that's the context. Everything that I do, because I work at an EAP, is about performance. So, is it possible for professional development to be affected by personal growth? Is there a point in time when who I am impacts what I do? And if that is true, then what's the relationship between the two? This first slide has about professional development is a willingness to learn information in order to improve my performance. But personal growth is my willingness to use the information in a way that impacts my belief system. So what I believe is true matters. I can take in all kinds of information and not apply it. When we are young, we are very susceptible to be influenced. In fact, there's a period in our life, usually between 5 and 10, where a lot of the things that we currently believe, we started to believe then. Now think about that. Today, we carry that information and it influences our decision making. Now, I don't know about you, but about that age, I kind of had this personal relationship with Santa Claus. I knew the tooth fairy by name. We discussed inflation. What else from that period of time do I still hold true today? When you consider that we have been influenced in ways that continues to be impactful in our decision making. And we consider what else was influencing us at the time. Should we question what we've come to believe? The way we grow has always been a product of our willingness to question what we currently believe. Some say the biggest obstacle to new knowledge is old knowledge. It's just that as we get older, we are less willing to let go of that, to challenge it. And it's in part due to core beliefs. We have a core belief that says, here's what I think is true. And over time, we develop a belief system around that, and then a defense system around that. So this thing is tight. It isn't meant for us to change overnight. In fact, when you think about the way we take in information, imagine a human being as a bucket. In the bucket is all that we have become. Now the rule is you can't take anything out of the bucket. You can't tip the bucket over. What's in there stays in there. But growth says I have to influence what's in the bucket. So how do I do that without tipping it over? I've got to add more stuff to the bucket. It influences what's in there. Our willingness to say, what do you believe? And how will that influence what I believe? It's really important. Because it is a lot to ask people to give up their beliefs. But we influence each other all the time, on a regular basis. So, bias, is it a bad thing? This is hard to see. Bias is an inclination towards a perspective. It's an opinion. It's my position. I would rather eat food than paper. That's a bias. It affects pretty much anything I have an opinion on. Now, when you consider this, in the course of populating this planet and the billions of people that are part of it, why is it that no two are alike? Out of all of the people, there is something different, something unique about each one of us. I'm kind of thinking at this point that it's supposed to be that way. So the idea that we will all at some point think the same, well, it's kind of elusive. I don't know that it's necessary. The idea that it is likely that we influence each other's opinions about a lot of things, that's been happening for a long time. But what's happening now? How is it that bias gets this bad rap and makes us defend before we even know what we're defending? You have to consider our belief system. Let me move this on here. Oops. Keep saying, don't let me walk out of here with this. I have too many. Oh, I just changed something here. Oh, you got it. So, our brains encode, store information, process it, and our brains have a knack for being able to absorb a tremendous amount of information. The problem is we can't process it as quickly as our brain takes it in.
Is that the right slide?
Oh, it's moving around here. Okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's all right. I probably did it. Let's see. Every connection that your brain makes is based on what has worked or what was already experienced. So, we don't start with a blank slate when we're affected by something. It doesn't just sit there by itself. It is already being affected by what's already there. And what's already there is an accumulation of things over a period of time. What we're looking at is the influence here of bias and our ability to determine how much it influences our decision making. Are we ready to say that it affects us in ways that we don't know? Are we ready to say that it is in play whether we choose it to be or not? Are we ready to say that we were never asked? We didn't get a vote. That for a lot of things, implicit bias says it exists at such a low level of awareness that I don't know how it impacts my decision making. In all fairness, that's the best we could say, is we don't know. Our instincts back us up is that we're hardwired to make choices that actually create bias. When you consider it is in our DNA to survive, to continue to exist. And this is in the background all the time. It's influencing the information that our brain thinks is interesting. It's valuable. I was at the movies the other day, and I was buying some popcorn. And at the moment I bought the popcorn, and she asked, "Do you want cheese or butter?" I thought to myself, how much of this decision is about my survival? You know, it's like I make decisions on a daily basis, but my brain is processing things in terms of my survival and procreation. And this popcorn doesn't seem to matter that much, but it is in play. Fight or flight is one of those instincts. Could you imagine what would happen to us if we got a choice to feel or not? Feelings are not like thoughts and behaviors. Feelings are involuntary. You are not asked to decide how you feel. You're asked to decide what you're going to do about it. But the feeling, the minute you recognize it, you're already having a thought. The feeling's already happened. Now, it's involuntary for a reason. If an event occurs, the first thing that happens is I am affected by it. I didn't get a vote, and I wonder what would happen if I did. Imagine, I can choose now to feel or not. So all the things that work in my behalf, that alert me, that keep me safe, aren't automatic anymore. It's like, this car is coming, but I can choose to not feel it if it hits me. I can choose all kinds of things. Well, that is true, I suppose, if I could anticipate a feeling and decide whether or not I wanted to affect my behavior. But more than likely, the car's going to run me down. And all of my efforts to survive are affected by this involuntary action that is designed to keep me safe, keep me alive. Bias operates in the exact same way. It can't ask you everything before it influences you. It just does. So throughout this, I want you to ask yourself, what's my opinion about bias? Is it negative? Is it positive? Does it matter to me? Should it matter? Can I control it? Is it bad? I've been talking about implicit bias. Bias that exists at a low level of awareness but has a big influence. In fact, most researchers believe it has a bigger influence than what we acknowledge on the conscious level. I can say how I've been influenced. I can say that that influence might affect my decision making in this way. But what can I say about the things that influence me that I don't know about? It's not much. Explicit bias says at a higher level of awareness, I'm not now just being influenced. I'm making choices. Which is something that's hard to influence as well. Let's suppose that I'm making a decision that clearly reflects a lack of knowledge. And so I gain knowledge in an effort to influence my decision. And it works. What was absent now has affected me when it's present, and I change my behavior. Will that work if my rationale is choice? What amount of knowledge will change my mind if I'm making a decision? Choice is a little different. Explicit bias exists on a much higher level of awareness. So we could start with bias, explicit bias, consisting of things like prejudice, bigotry, discrimination, and all of the isms. Can we tell the difference between explicit and implicit bias? Sure. Is it difficult? No. The higher the level of awareness, the more likely you will see me parade my belief system. So it's not that hard to figure out. And choice is a very different issue. But implicit bias tends to impact us even more than explicit bias. In fact, the research says that we can have a conscious level of awareness of something and have a subconscious level of awareness that contradicts the first. Even though we say consciously, this is what I believe, our subconscious can contradict it. It is that influential. Implicit bias occurs on the surface, and as you explore the environment, you absorb information continuously without trying. It's the way it's supposed to work. We have feelings that allow us to absorb data constantly. Doesn't ask for our opinion, we're just affected. Our brain is processing information as we walk into the room, like the temperature in the room. It's something that I become aware of before I can see the thermometer. The awareness, the existence, the incidence rate of implicit bias is much higher. Truth is, if I decide that I'm going to be affected by things that are beyond my control, thank you so much, that are beyond my control, I'm going to be influenced by things that I'm not aware of yet. And is there anything wrong with that? Well, let's see. We have our feelings, our behaviors, and our thoughts, and these things happen in response to an event. So something occurs, and one of these three things happens. Which one happens first? I feel. Why? It's involuntary. We have 5 senses. We feel, we taste, we touch, we smell, we hear. They're also involuntary. They're on all the time. For most of us, all the time. Now, these 5 senses have to access us through one of these 3 ways: our feelings, our thoughts, and our behaviors. And only one of them is involuntary. So all this information that's coming in from our senses is affecting us, and we don't get a vote. How much can we say we're in control of what we do and how we think? That's a lot of input, and it's on all the time. I gotta quit putting this in my pocket. Explicit attitudes are attitudes that exist at a conscious level Implicit attitudes exist at a subconscious level, and it's quite possible that the two are in conflict with each other. This diagram here, I don't know if you can see it, but it gives an example of this process where my awareness of my competence is something that occurs kind of in 4 stages. I can be aware of my competence and know that I'm incompetent. My awareness can also be of my competence, and I know that I have a certain level of competence, but I could be better. I can also be unaware of my competence, or I can decide to act on it. So I'm not making a decision about whether or not it is true. I'm making an assumption. I'm competent. I should do this. Let's go forward. And it's also possible for me to not be aware of what I don't know. So, I don't know something, and I don't know that I don't know. Who knows what I will do in response to that? And all of these levels exist pretty much at the same time. Oops. So where do attitudes come from that impact bias? Attitudes kind of take the shape of either feelings or thoughts or behaviors. So an attitude is a conclusion that I draw about something, whatever the object is. I make a decision about how I feel about it, what I think about it, what I should do about it. The attitude is based on any of these 3 parts, but typically one more than the other. So the answer to the question, where do attitudes come from, could be my feelings, my thoughts, or my behaviors. Attitudes that are based on feelings or affective components tend to be pretty strong. A lot of what we feel about our values and beliefs are feeling-based attitudes. We tend to take a very strong opinion about these attitudes because we feel very strongly about things. These would be things like religion and politics and our personal opinions about things. Behavioral component is another source of attitudes, and it's reflected in how we feel about, how we act on things. So if I don't know how I feel about something, but I remember how I acted in response to it, I can pretty much figure out what my attitude was. If I demonstrate defensiveness, if I demonstrate arrogance, if I'm told that my body language is communicating something, it doesn't take a lot for me to figure out I probably have a certain feeling about it. Behavioral attitudes, though, are communicated almost immediately. So it's not just me that knows how I feel now. My posture, my nonverbals are communicating things in advance. Cognitive components, or how we think, our attitudes are affected by our experience, by our development, by how we are impacted by the beliefs of others. So how we're different impacts our attitudes. How we develop at the time. What I believed when I was 12 is very different than what I believe now. And so when we learn something, impacts also what we believe. And we've already said, we've learned some things a long time ago that still impact who we are. But do we think about that at the time we're learning? That, well, here's an example. At some point, everybody here was afraid of the dark. Long, long time ago. We weren't sure why, we just knew it was dark. Do you remember when you ceased to be afraid of the dark? Do you remember how old you were when it stopped? When you were afraid? I did it again. I know I did it again. Do you know when it changed? See, we can remember being afraid of the dark, but we don't know when we stopped, so we just know we did. The nature of the way we learn is almost always after the fact. If you have, let's say, kids, and you realize that as they learn things, they don't always tell you. you realize after the fact that they figured something out. Is it in their best interest to tell you at the moment they learned something? Or are you better off not knowing as a parent? What benefit would I have, let's say, as a 16-year-old, alerting my parents that I learned some things about life? When there's a clear advantage that I not know better. I have an excuse for almost everything that I do. So we can form beliefs based on experiences that have previously occurred, based on our development at the time, based on the beliefs of others and how we're affected by it, which kind of is our way out of this. The brain processes things at an extremely high rate. Most scientists believe that in a second, the brain is processing about 11 million bits of information. We, however, only have the capacity to realize about 40. What happens to all the rest of that information? 11 million bits of information in a second. Could you imagine trying to remember all that and deliberately allow yourself to be influenced by it? Or for that matter, imagine 11 million bits of information is influencing you and you don't know it. It's in play. So one of the problems that our biases create is in how to process that much information. It's a lot of information coming in, and we have to figure out what to do with it, or at least our brain does. And our brain doesn't stop and say, we need to consider all this stuff. It starts making decisions based on what it believes is important. And what's important is our survival. Again, every decision you make is not life or death. But for some of us, our occupation puts us in a position where, yeah, a lot of our decisions may be considered life and death. A lot of our decisions make us make decisions quickly. It matters. Some of the other issues that are related to this first problem, we tend to, in an effort to kind of process all of this information, is we boost the importance of some things over others. And sometimes it's just because they're unusual. We notice when something has changed just because it's different. We're drawn to details that confirm existing beliefs because it's familiar. And we notice flaws in others more easily than we notice in ourselves because that's just how we are. If I do it again, let me know.
Oh, I got you.
Another way that our biases complicate things that is related to the way our brain stores information and the ability to process so much. We don't have enough meaning. When you have a lot of information coming in, that's one problem. When you can't understand all of it, we're able to understand a sliver of information, but we still are placed in a position where we have to make some decisions. What do we do to compensate with the small amount of information that we have? How do we respond to our brain's ability to give us more information and life being as complex as it is? So we fill in gaps. We fill in characteristics from stereotypes, generalities. We imagine what we're fond of, familiar with, better than what we're not. All of these are ways that we compensate for what we don't know. So we're weeding through, or our brain is weeding through a lot of information and presenting us with some limited information about how we should respond. And it does all of this without asking. Another way our biases create bias is we need to act fast. So we're constrained by time and information, and yet we can't let that paralyze us. And again, for some professions, this is more important than others. The circumstances that I have are affected by the severity and the amount of time I have to make a decision. And if that decision could be life or death, it ups the stakes. Another way is what should we remember? It's a lot of information, and we have to decide what's valuable and what isn't. And listen to some of the things that we decide that help us make a decision, or at least our brain. We edit and reinforce some memories after the fact. This is like remembering something and filling in the blanks, and the outcome is I changed the whole story. I had a friend that I used to go fishing with, and he used to tell me stories of trips that he took that I wasn't there. And it was one of his stories that I kind of liked a lot. And so over time, that story became mine. And I started telling that story with great detail as if I had been there. I added to it. It was beautiful. One of my favorite stories. Well, one day he happened to be there while I was telling a group of people this story. And he stops me and says, "You stole my story." And I argued with him. It was his story, always was his story. But in my mind, it was mine. And these stories also got into how big the fish was and everything else like that. But over time, what we remember, based on the way our brains store information, doesn't have to be accurate. Over time, we will influence the information in ways that we like. Let's suppose that I have a difficult time with critical feedback. I only like good news about me. And let's suppose that I have no tolerance, really, for critical feedback. How will that affect how I take in information? Will I be receptive to hear things that I don't particularly want to hear? I'm screening that out right away. Will I be receptive to things that view me in a bad light? Nope, gone. I've limited now what I am able to take in to a very narrow piece of information, and it's all I've got. So my personality now is influencing my bias, among a whole lot of other things that could influence it. Oh, please tell me I didn't do this again. We're back. This is going to be difficult because the print is so small. There's a downside of these 4 ways that our biases influence our decision making. Again, our brain creates these problems by the amount of information that it processes. Our brains then have to solve the problem by how it kind of weeds out information. It also complicates things. Like, we don't see everything. Some information we filter out is useful and important. Again, if I'm a really self-centered person, I'm going to filter information that doesn't make me look good. Now, it could be pertinent. It could be significant. And my rationale for filtering it out is it pinches a little bit. Our search for meaning can conjure up illusions and imagine details constructed by assumptions. We create what's missing. Our brain is kind of wired to do that. Quick decisions can seriously be flawed. There's this concept. It's a group concept. It's called groupthink. You've probably heard of it. And groupthink says that when a group is in stress, it will do its best to not further the stress by disagreeing with each other. So the first idea that's on the table is the one that we have a tendency to go with. Now, it could be the worst idea you've ever heard, and typically they are. But we are inclined to not disagree with it, and so we agree with something that essentially isn't very good. There's this other theory that says when a group is in stress, it will look to leadership to solve its problems. It will say to leadership, you are powerful. and a genius. And you can fix anything. And so we bestow on leadership the power to make decisions in our behalf. Now, we know right away that this problem that we've just turned over to leadership can't be solved by one person. They're too complex. So we're really setting up leadership. And as soon as leadership is unable to perform a task that they never could, we now want to replace leadership. Sounds familiar? Happens where I work all the time. We replace leadership all the time as if we've solved the problem. Let's move on here. This is a bias codex. It's kind of an index of biases. And this index is based on these 4 problems that are created by our brains based on the amount of information our brain wants to process. So each of these 4 problems has subcategories, the types of problems that each category presents. And each subcategory has about 10 different biases. Now this is 25% of this little graph here. So imagine the other 3/4. All of these are recognized biases. They're legitimate. We've put some thought into them and said, yes, it's true, they exist. On this whole codex of biases, there's probably about 175 biases. In fact, let's look at some. There's one in here I kind of like. It's called the Google effect. The tendency to forget information that can be found readily online by using internet search engines. Once we know where to find it, we forget it. There's another one I kind of like. The inclination to see past events as being more predictable than they actually were. This is also called the I knew it all along bias. And these are legitimate biases. They play a role. Let's see. Fading effect bias is a bias in which the emotion associated with the unpleasant memory fades more quickly than emotions associated with positive ones. We forget stuff we don't like faster because we don't like it. Biases can be stored as true and false memories. The way our brain stores information doesn't discriminate whether or not the information is true or not. It just stores it. So when we recall it as a memory, it could be false. Because the brain says, this is what I remember. Not, oh yeah, and by the way, it's not true. It just says, this is what I remember. And so we can have memories that never happened. From our DNA, in terms of fight, flight, survival, procreation, to the way our brain works, in terms of the amount of information our brains processes, it means that bias is normal. It means that bias is unavoidable. It means that you cannot be unbiased. It's as human as our fingerprints. If the goal is to change our attitude about bias, if we are able to say, it's not what I thought, it's not negative, it's not positive, it just is. It's a product of our brain's capacity to take in information. Would it affect how we respond to bias? How quickly would we point fingers? How much could we make a case about anyone's bias in light of the fact that ours is just like it? See, we have given bias a bad rap. If bias was something that determined the flavor of ice cream we like, we'd probably feel pretty good about it. And it does. But bias is also seen in the context of how we treat each other, how we make decisions that affect each other. If we were going to impact bias, what will we do? We have to compensate for bias. We have to acknowledge the reality that exists. We have to accept our own, and we have to accept the biases of others. And it's easier said than done. If we were going to try to influence bias in positive ways, though, like Some of us are in occupations where your willingness and your ability to understand what affects your thinking is the only tool you have. I have one of those jobs. I have to be able to question what I believe. If I were a police officer, I have to be able to trust what I believe. I have to be able to influence my bias, because remember, I can't take anything out of the bucket. I can only put more stuff in. So if we were going to improve our ability to compensate for bias and actually take advantage of it, what would it look like? Well, here's the chalkboard. Let's design a method of improving how we are affected by bias. Let's suppose that E is an event, something that happens. And we're going to qualify this event. We're going to say that we already have a feeling about this event. For example, jaywalking is against the law, technically, right? And so it's an event that anybody could observe. But when we qualify the event, we say the law says jaywalking is this. So, is it true now that if jaywalking is qualified, all jaywalking is the same? Well, if we believe that the law is the same no matter who jaywalks, then yes. So we can qualify the event if, let's say, it's against the law to do it. A plus B is a shared experience. Two people see the same thing and have an opinion about it. E over A plus B equals an outcome. So this event shared by two people makes them respond a certain way. That's the outcome. Is it true that if the event is qualified, the two other people can say that what they observed was the same thing? So, these two people saw someone jaywalk and these two people saw someone jaywalk. Doesn't matter who's jaywalking, that's the same event. We've just qualified all jaywalking to be the same thing because the law is clear. Now, we've got 4 people who witnessed 2 events, but we can say it's the same. What happens now, then, if we ask 8 people what they saw? 8 people have a shared experience, even though it wasn't the same one, and we ask them to talk to each other. Because even though the law is clear, it's one event, there are 8 people who have a different impression of it. So, why won't we have a discussion about that? Let's talk about what we each saw, because we each saw something slightly different, but we're qualifying this as the same event. What is gained by this discussion? What will happen if 8 of us sit down and share why we made certain decisions? Will we influence each other? Could we learn anything? We might come up with some ways that we prefer to deal with it. We might come up with ways that some person looked at that others didn't. Over time, we can influence each other to the extent where we now have more information than we started with. You have to put more in the bucket. This is the way of doing it, how we influence each other. So imagine a group of individuals wanting to go further. Now let's see if we can influence the outcome more. We've influenced the process by sharing. What if there's certain things we want to look at, like indirect influences? What incidental things were also present at the moment of jaywalking? Time of day, did it matter? The community it happened in, did it matter? How much did it factor in? Prior outcomes. What's our history with jaywalking? Should it influence what we do in the present and our plans for the future? That's an indirect influence that we should consider. Environmental factors. What kind of things were happening surrounding this event that some of us noticed and others didn't? Can we be deliberate and say, let's look for this? Leadership directive. What if in response to the information that we've gathered from talking with each other, leadership says, do this. Do this for the next 4 months. Let's take a look at how that might influence outcomes. What about advisory committees, recommendations? Looking at a lot of different things, and I like this thing. Can we be deliberate about doing that for a period of time and taking a look at what the outcomes are? So there's a lot of things that we can do to influence outcomes if we accept the fact that we have to allow ourselves to influence each other if we're going to affect bias. And it's not really asking a whole lot. So if we look directly at influence and beliefs, let's say we want to identify an event. What are we going to look at? Identify a period of time. How long are we going to look at it? Assign parameters for this. What beliefs are we trying to influence? Well, all of them. Collect and process the data. Imagine if we're recording information on a content management system that allows us to continuously add information to about why we do what we do. Isn't that a neat little tool to reference? Follow-up discussion. I do process groups a lot. I work with groups in a way that says, we're about to learn something, and it's going to happen in the course of this process. So going into it, we don't know what the outcome will be. We know everything will occur in that meeting. And what happens in that meeting is this exchange of ideas and some conclusions that are drawn and some self-awareness. And a process group is meant to take advantage of the moment, what we can learn at that time from each other that makes us better. Now, I started this whole discussion with my belief system, let me see, that says, in the context of work, how do we get better at what we do? And it was kind of prefaced with, does personal growth impact professional development? If I learn more about who I am, will I be better at what I do? Yes. Training individuals to be better at what they do when it comes to sharpening your skills. It's something that, one, I have to be motivated to take a look at what I've come to believe. Two, it has to be in the context of people that I respect, whose opinions matter to me. Three, I have to be personally affected by the outcome. All of these things increase my motivation to want to learn from other people. It's not just anybody. If we all had the same job and we all influence each other typically anyway, then why won't we be deliberate about it in terms of our efforts to influence each other? And who are we more likely to listen to? Part of what I do involves a level of confidentiality that makes it possible for someone to trust that I will keep that in confidence. And it changes the way groups interact with each other, especially in a work setting. In a work setting, there are risks, and they are real, in terms of how what I say might impact me. There are things that I might want to talk about, but it might not be wise to talk to my supervisor about. I may have peer group or peer network that doesn't exist at my site, but they exist in other sites. It's kind of like some levels of supervision. There's one person assigned to each work group. That peer group is another group with that person who's in that level of supervision. How do we get these two people together where they can benefit from what they learn? And wouldn't it be easier for them to be able to problem solve, discuss topics? In truth, if you're really going to grow, you have to be willing to talk about everything. And what would make it safe to talk about everything? So, you have been very quiet. I'm curious about how you feel about this. And I didn't want to just leave it up to me talking to you, but do you have any thoughts about this whole process of influencing our biases? Do you have questions about anything? Do you have thoughts? Do you disagree? I don't have a really good concept of time. My wife will tell you that. So you'll have to tell me where we are at time-wise in terms of how much time we have for questions.
30 minutes.
Okay.
So I have a question.
Yes.
What range do you see among people in your group settings in terms of what their biases are, how strongly they're already felt, and whether they can be successfully influenced by the group?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know what's interesting is when I start to work with a group, I'm the last one there. I know the least. So when I ask a group, I explain to them, here's what I do. I work with groups, we problem solve, we work things out. I'm here talking to you. Does anybody know why I'm here? And without fail, everybody in the group knows why I'm there. So they've already crossed these bridges. They're being faced with, okay, is it safe within this group to talk with each other? Do we know what we would talk about? Yes. Is there a norm in this group that says we shouldn't talk? Sometimes. Are there two kind of belief systems in a group? Two hierarchies, you know, the organizational structure and influence. All of these things impact the safety of the conversation. And so, yes, you do have to get a group to a place where you're qualifying their participation. But at some point, the group believes that they are the only ones that can influence each other because they're there. And in any organization, the first line of accountability comes from your peers, not your boss. Your peers are immediately influenced by what you do. Shouldn't you hear back from them? And how difficult is it? I have this kind of a exercise that I do that says, if there was a problem, say I had a problem with Preston, and I wanted to use the protocols to address my problem with Preston. And the first step is actually not to Preston, it's to come over and have a conversation with you about Preston. And we decide that we need to join you to discuss how we need to deal with Preston. And then there's a committee discussion that happens that says, okay, here's our position on this thing. And eventually somebody sends Preston a memo. It says, here's what you did, to the guy who's sitting right next to you. Or I could turn to Preston and say, cut that out. Because we used to do that. Would you say that our society is moving more towards me or we? Me. How does that play out in the workplace? Oh, yes. Can the work afford to not have a group of people to do the work? For that matter, would anyone volunteer to do the work of everybody else? See, that's not going to happen. So we need each other. But we're moving in a direction that says we don't. Groups need help to become what groups are meant to become. More cohesive, higher performing, and more accountable to each other. Otherwise, this thing that happens where a problem happens and we decide that somebody else is supposed to solve it, that's one option. So we walk down the hall to someone who doesn't even know that the problem exists yet and say, here, this is yours to fix. Or we could decide that if we're not going to solve the problem, we can blame somebody for it. Blame's always good. Because once I've decided that Preston is the problem, I'm done. I walk away like I fixed something. Is it possible to avoid conflict? Or does it follow you?
Follows.
Do we act in a manner that suggests that we can avoid conflict? Absolutely. So there's some things in place in terms of how groups work that, yeah, we can do a much better job with. But you have to keep in mind, we're moving toward me. And so we come to the workplace with a different skill set than we used to. We now have to be deliberate about teaching that cohesiveness. When I ask a group what's the problem, I usually hear two things: communication and trust. And so I say, okay, well, communication, I hear a lot about that. Let's talk about this communication thing. And almost always what I find is it's not a communication problem. It's a conflict avoidance problem, which is a little different. We know how to communicate. But if you say it's a communication problem, I can guarantee you we will bring someone in to discuss communication. We won't fix a thing, but it'll be fun. Conflict avoidance says I choose to not communicate. That's different. That's a collective process in terms of resolving it. Because once the norm is in place, we avoid conflict, then we can't problem solve. And if we can't problem solve, we come up with some really neat ways to reconcile the problem other than solve it. This is where blame comes in. We start to find fault. We start to make implications about who did this or who did that. And there's no problem solving happening. But when you consider, if your group is functioning well, it's like adding 2 people. Performance goes up that much. If your group isn't functioning well, it's like losing 2 people. And you got folks in that group that are working harder than they ever have because there's no benefit of this collective. It's all siloed. So yeah, that group dynamic is real important, especially when you're talking about areas as sensitive as bias. The group has to trust each other. And part of the process in terms of how we influence each other is a cohesive process. And wouldn't it be neat if within our group we could talk about anything? Imagine a group that has a practice of processing problems. Imagine how far ahead of most groups they would be. We wouldn't be talking about, what did you do in response to this report that says this? We would be able to say, what we are doing in response to that goes well beyond what anybody is doing. The issue isn't does the problem exist. The issue is how you respond to it. What are you doing about it? And I think this stuff should be huge. Yeah?
All right, so you're talking about, small groups. I think that when we have a municipality which is a huge group of 40,000, 50,000 people, the committee that is going to address it is perhaps the police review board in some instances, but a lot of times, we're talking about group consciousness on a very large scale. How are you going to address or train or have that kind of communication about whether there's going to be truth or trust or not? I mean, we don't have that. I don't see how the process. I think it breaks down the larger the group you get.
Well, I'll tell you, there is some truth to that. The larger the group, the greater the risk, because the level of trust across a large group of people is different. But we don't work in groups that large. See, that may represent 5, 6, 7, 10 different groups. What we're looking for are core groups of people who influence each other's behavior. And of course, we can divide these groups into workable sizes. But the obstacle in terms of the size of the group, that's always been an issue. What do we do when the group's too large? We make it smaller.
Or we make a law, but nobody necessarily obeys the law. I mean, the tools are not adequate to the process that's required.
Okay, if we were going to change the process, wouldn't we still be looking at, okay, where do we start? We start with these same groups. We're talking about, are we faced with problems that have no solutions? That's really what we're talking
Oh,
about.
I don't think so, perhaps, but, I mean, if it's not gonna be, if the solutions aren't proposed by, municipal ordinance or law, then they have to come from the community, and there's other groups that might influence them, like, perhaps the church groups, or, clubs or something. So I guess you can only be able to train people in pockets and not as a whole.
I think that groups influence each other. I think people influence each other. I think if we're concerned that there's this overriding attitude that affects a large group of people, how did that start? We didn't all wake up one day and decide to feel the way we do. It started on a smaller scale.
Yeah, but almost no group, you already said, we're so individualized that almost no group is cohesive when it begins.
True. The process of becoming cohesive is in part a voluntary process.
Right. I mean, in the community, it's the activist who brings the request for charge forward. And yet there's a reaction against activism. And we have, innumerable examples of how slow change can occur in a community.
Well,
I guess I'm not hearing anything beyond theory at this moment in time.
I guess what I'm hearing is an understanding of what is possible and what isn't, and a decision that's based on that before we challenge it. Currently, what I do at the university in an EAP program isn't being done anywhere. See, we tend to deal with individuals in EAP, but we decided let's work with groups. And so when we started out, there were 2 groups that were involved the first year. Since that time, it's grown. So this past year, I worked with 47 groups. The year before that, about 45. Now, there is an advertisement for this service. People are telling each other. And did I have an idea that the response would be that when I started? No way did I think it would. But it does create this piece that's missing in society, and that is collective process. That is, what we are capable of doing as a group goes beyond what we can do as individuals, and it's really hard to place a value on how far behind, because each group is different. I would say that regardless of what we have come to believe based on past experience, you don't impact the future from past experience. You impact the future by what you do in the present. If we decide that the past impacts the future, then what's the point of the present? It has no purpose. I'm not there yet. I think we can. Yeah.
In your groups, what are you doing? Are you trying to change thought habits? Are we looking at a component of cognitive behavioral therapy where thoughts impact actions, thoughts impact behaviors, behaviors impact results? What is it? I'm unclear as to what's going on in the groups that you're working on.
Well, there's a couple of different approaches that I use, and it's really based on the size of the group. So in some groups, I sit in with the group as they process things, as they go about their normal way of doing things. And I might stop the group at various points and ask, why do you do that?
Can you give an example of something that you would help them process?
Okay, well, we talked a little bit about conflict. A lot of groups struggle with conflict. In fact, we've gotten to a place socially where conflict avoidance is the desired process. What I raise is our beliefs about conflict. Are our beliefs about conflict based on the front end, the part that pinches, or the back end, where we resolve something? Because it's important. It makes us then individually look at our attitude about conflict. I meet in another way with groups, a different approach, where I meet with every individual in the group. Because now I'm trying to move individuals from a way of thinking. And I meet with the group collectively to challenge the group's methods. its norms. And then I meet with individuals again, because now I want some ownership. If we're going to change things, what will you own in terms of how you contribute? See, it's not possible for a problem to exist in a group for any length of time and not involve everybody there. If the only way you contribute is your tolerance for it, is your silence, you contribute. And so the goal in meeting with individuals is about personal ownership and in challenging belief systems. The goal with meeting with a group is about restructuring. When groups go through changes, they fragment. They're supposed to, because each individual is being affected differently. When groups come back together, they have an enormous amount of information now, and they have to redefine themselves anyway. You know, we are now dealing with this set of circumstances, fewer resources, fewer people, new leadership, whatever. And so the goal is, there's a process that groups go through that involve fragmentation based on how they're affected, and then rebuilding with a whole new identity that's focused on whatever the agenda of the workplace is. So there's a couple of different ways to approach it. And a process group, it's about what do we know that if we share might improve the way we all do things. I'm assuming that the group has the answers. They just haven't shared them with each other yet. Yeah.
Okay, I want to kind of go back to the question what I heard earlier. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing is it's a process, but you have to start somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you kind of have to come into it with a first an understanding that you have this bias. That's exactly what we're talking about,
That's
right?
exactly what we're talking about.
And once you identify that you have the bias, it's easier to create change from the inside out instead of trying to come from the outside.
Yeah, our initial response to bias is defensive. And that has more to do with our understanding of it. But if our understanding about bias is normalized, it's human, then we're not starting at a disadvantage.
Now, looking at the community, for instance, talking about Urbana, when he asked about the large group, if we start within the city, right? I mean, a lot of people, now everybody doesn't live in the city of Urbana, but a lot of people, everybody who works in the city of Urbana influences something in Urbana. Mm-hmm. So if you start with this, what would be considered a small group in the relationship to the community, with creating this shift in mindset, this shift in change, then this group, the entity of the city, can go out into the community and affect each one, teach one. You know, just kind of spread that information, and
It does already.
that's how you can affect larger groups. That's just my viewpoint. That's what I think I heard.
To a great extent, that is how it happens. Is we don't affect an entire group all at once simultaneously, especially a large group. It grows. In fact, however the group, whatever the makeup of the group is now, whatever it's struggling with, it grew to that place. So yeah, it is something that says, let's take a look at the way we do things and see what happens if we change this. And then let's see what happens if we change that. And let's see what happens if this thing snowballs, if we start to impact each other. See, the one thing that is undeniable, we affect each other. We impact each other. That, I think, is something we should use to our advantage, because things don't get to the way they do just out of the blue.
Could I shift a little before we run out of time and ask my fellow board members what they think how this bears upon our responsibilities
Sure.
as members of the Urbana Civilian Police Review Board, in thinking about bias, implicit bias, our bias, anyone that we encounter in the work we do? I wonder if any of us have reflected on that based on what we've learned. Thank you.
I can respond to that. for myself, I suppose. One of the things we know about implicit bias is that it tends to influence us more under two sets of circumstances: when stress levels are high and when the stimulus is ambiguous. So we have, which of course is a situation that law enforcement has to deal with daily, that combination. On the board, we have the ability to, we don't have the ability to remove the ambiguity. Some of the cases that we're going to review, I think, are going to be ambiguous. But I think we do have, because of the benefit of time, and we don't have to make time-pressured decisions, we can lower the stress level a little bit. But, you know, in terms of implicit bias, I mean, one of the things that I was hearing you saying, one of the things that you know, one of the important things I try to hold on to is the more that we do our own work, the more we're aware of the biases that we bring to the cases that we review. I think not that we're going to eliminate our own bias, but as a collective, I think we can make less biased decisions. So that's where I'm at with it.
That's excellent, Mikhail. I was on another tangent as you were answering questions, because for me, one of the gains of this is very much setting a standard that says individually we can only amount to so much. In groups where there is trust and there is this set of circumstances, we can create so much more than our individual selves. Because ultimately that is a higher standard, that is progress, and while an individual in a particular situation, a policeman or a citizen, may fall because that's what they could, whatever bias or everything else they bring to the situation, we as a group, when we process, ought to be able to say, that's what happened, but as a group we expect X, because we know that that X is higher than what was brought to that situation. And that includes both individuals looking at what happened and saying, you know what, I did what I could and it wasn't enough because together we could have done better. And I think that happens over and over again in situations, especially when I interact with law enforcement. We're usually not looking to make it better. We're usually in some kind of competition or subtraction. But a lot of what you said today, I have to admit, was over my head. In that I'm processing the previous thought, and then by the time I get to making a little bit sense of it, you're on the next one. So I do want to watch the video on this and try to catch more. But I do take a positive feeling that I can't control to say I have to learn. I did not want to come today to go over implicit bias again. I've heard several of the processes, but you've taken me to the next curious. My curiosity is aroused as to what groups do, so I thank you for that.
Are we good?
Well, first of all, I think what I heard tonight, Morris, was that I was freed from the standpoint that bias is normal, so there's no reason to take a defensive position about it. It is what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And number two, the hope that I found in your comments tonight is that if we are smart enough and open enough, that we can begin to compensate for our biases by developing trust groups where you can, well, brainstorming, think tanks, whatever, where you can end up coming out with a conclusion or decision that's broader than what your thoughts were when you went into that whole situation. That's the hope that I got from your presentation.
On a real direct level, if you have a group that in discussion, there's typically 2 or 3 voices. And that group moves to where everybody is talking. You've done a lot. And that's not that big a task. Typically, groups have a silent majority that we need to get to talk. Imagine group members challenging each other's beliefs, accommodating each other's beliefs. That's further than we've gone. We typically don't talk much in groups. I think it's worth finding out what will happen if we did.
Any other questions from anyone? Audience? No? Yes? Yes, young lady.
I wonder if you can speak to, so I was just thinking about there's this article roughly named like the diversity sense of community dialectic, which is basically talking about how like because of homophily, like the desire to be near people who are like you, that that like diversity and sense of community are in tension with one another, and so like as groups become more diverse, the sense of community decreases, and as community increases, or sense of community increases, often those groups become more and more like alike, homogenous. So I'm wondering if you can like speak to that dynamic. I mean, whether or not you think it's true or not, but specifically like in group processes, like how, because I'm hearing the importance of trust and kind of a sense of community and yeah.
Okay.
In general, just like how that works with group processes.
Well, my experience is a little different. Homogeneous groups have a belief that because we appear to be similar, that we think the same way. And it isn't true. But I'm less inclined to challenge in a homogeneous group because my assumption is we all think the same. In a heterogeneous group, they tend to be much higher functioning because there's no assumption that says we probably think the same way. We look across the room and we know we are at a different place. Now, can we benefit from our differences? That's really the key in terms of how the group will function. Are we afraid of our differences or are we curious? But even in student groups at the university, when you put a group of students together that are from very different backgrounds, they work much better as a group because the discussion is much more lively. And we're not making assumptions that we think the same, but also we're looking at problems from very different points of view. And so we're saying, if you're over here looking at this, it looks like this. And from over there, I never considered that point of view. So in my experience, the opposite is true. Homogeneous groups really tend to not challenge each other. And it's based just on an assumption that we all think the same. You just mix up the generations in the group and the same thing will happen. So yeah, I deliberately try to put people that are different together because the thing will act on its own. It's a good question. Yeah.
So we've been working towards addressing, if you look at Dennis's comments around police-community relations and how we improve them, and looking at the impact of the historical issues around trust in police-community relations, primarily in low-income and minority African-American communities. And so we just did some survey work, and it was very indicative that we've got a long way to go to break through these historical trust issues, which significantly impact the biases in starting to try to have these conversations. How do we start this? How do we start that process of understanding we've got historical trust issues, to have conversations about how we break through those so that we then begin to address the issue? I don't know if I'm asking that in a
No,
direct enough question. And I know
You got
there's
that.
time to,
I think that when we look at, let's say, a group like a group of police officers, we might make an assumption that because they all dress the same, they all have the same job, that they all have the same feelings. And it's a misconception. But how often within a group of police officers, is there discussion that says, well, here's a point of view that's different from yours? Like, does it happen that in a discussion group, that if someone voices an opinion, that everyone else decides that's how we feel? Because the first change has to happen within the group if the group is expected to be perceived differently. Otherwise, the group is viewed as a homogeneous group and everybody feels the same way. So within that group itself, there is just no way everybody feels the same way. But there is probably reasons for people to not share their opinions, to not influence that group. And that's where you start. That level within the group has to be, the trust level has to be at a place where we don't have this belief that we can't share our opinions. We do challenge each other's methods, processes, decision making. And who better? I mean, essentially that has to start from within that group. That group then influences the externals, the adjacent systems. But it doesn't happen where the group just automatically starts to influence an environment that already has a perception of it. You have to change the perception from within. And a lot of cases you have every different possible facet of human behavior within that group, various walks of life, different opinions, but are they shared? Is the intent for us to think the same or to think differently and to challenge each other? See, we all might decide that there should be only one interpretation of the law, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's only one way of expressing my insight about the circumstances of the law. The situations that I walk upon, no two people are going to see the same thing. How often do we share it? And how valuable information that is. See, the conversation has to start within the group before it can impact anything outside the group. We're trying to change impressions of people that have been around for a long time. We're trying to change how folks' attitudes have been in place based on extended experience over generations. That doesn't happen overnight, and it definitely doesn't happen without influencing the group from within. Everything seems to start from that and work its way out. In either case, we should be looking at what we've tried and what we haven't tried. What haven't we tried? Is there a lot left to do?
Well, and we can also look at what other communities have done, and to the degree that we like the outcomes that they achieved, we can try some of those things. And some of what we've learned from other communities echo what you're saying, which is that these kinds of dialogues are more effective when police departments start to do their own work and have dialogues internally before they start to talk to the communities, and when the communities start to have their own dialogues internally before they start to talk to law enforcement, as one piece. And then the second piece has to do with the trust that I've heard you talk about, and we know what, in terms of, policing African American communities, we know where the areas of distrust are. That probably isn't the best place to start the conversation. So it takes time to build trust, and one of the ways to do it is just to start to get to know people and see each other beyond the roles that we occupy and as fellow human beings. And so we start with the commonalities and not with the differences. But there are models that other communities have been utilizing, and we can see what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Well, thank you. Oh, do you have a question,
Just
Ricardo?
a quick addition, because I think Dennis left left that pending. I think if we don't think of Urbana as a community, we think of it as many groups within the physical area of Urbana. We have a chance at this dialogue, because there are many groups we represent. We each wear several hats, several roles, and in each one of them, there can be a conversation that is leading towards a higher ideal, and the addition of those groups becomes, if not the full change, an impetus of several groups going towards a positive change. And for me, that means also in the police relations. There are many reasons to distrust in which you can rely and say, I don't want to try anymore. On the contrary, there are many opportunities in which we can interact, make it better, create that, I want to make sure I had them right, create a safe conversation, respect, if you respect the people, and that if you're affected by the outcome. I think all those apply, can apply to groups within Urbana that then in the sum are the community of Urbana. But we have to start in the pieces of it. Thanks.
Morris Mosley, thank you so very, very much.
Oh, thank you.
We will also, for those people who put their names and emails, you guys are an exception, we will be sending out the PowerPoint slides electronically to everybody so that you can have them. And once again, thank you so very much, Morris. I think it's a good start. You have given us a lot to think about. I do think I am half full. Thank you, Morris, for the clicker.
See that?
But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for optimism, and so I thank you so much for just kind of giving us a lot to think about this evening. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any announcements? No announcements?
Martin Luther King, MLK.
Can we get a motion for adjournment then?
I have one thing before we end. Apparently, at the last meeting, we didn't make it clear that that we had some pending questions with the chief, and so I'd like to make sure that that's on the agenda for next time, or whichever way the protocol requires that we do, because, for example, these surveys and that information, I think that's relevant to what we do, but I had no idea it was going on, and therefore, I request that we do and put it on the agenda for next time.
Okay. Can you make a note of that, please?
I just want to be clear. You want to invite the chief?
No, we said a group of us would visit the chief with the questions that got pending last time.
Oh, yep. Okay. Thank you. Oh, and there is one other small announcement. We're going to be having the Dr. King program on January 12th, 2018. It will be at the Vineyard Church. And just look for more information, probably emails from our office about, that will provide more information about that.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, motion for adjournment.
So moved.
There's a motion. Second? Second. Okay. We officially adjourn.